First of all, good morning and a quick introduction to myself. Obviously, I'm Geoff Evans. I'm a social worker probation officer by training back in the 70s. For the last 40 years, I've worked in schools, adult provision, and with families of children with autism. For 22 years, I was head of social work services with the National Autistic Society. I've been a director of a private providing company for 10 years. More recently, I'm saying more recently, only when you're in your 70s can 20 years be recent. But more recently, I was senior lecturer in autism at Sheffield Hallam University. I'm now a freelance trainer consultant. And just to give you some idea of the breadth of perhaps my work, at the moment, I'm working online with about 12 teenagers on a regular basis who are some of the most intelligent young people, autistic young people that you probably could encounter, but have lots of difficulties around social behaviours and anxiety, stress, and their sexuality. I'm also working with the nuclear power industry and doing training for them because they have a very high number of autistic people working for them. And sometimes that causes challenges for the autistic person and for the nuclear power industry. So we're working with that, and perhaps at an extreme, but I'm consultant to Wakefield High Security Prison, where there is a wing for 9 autistic people who have committed the most serious crimes that can be committed in our society. And the prison service is struggling to meet their needs, but to meet the needs of those people who are supporting them. So that's just a little bit about myself and, the kind of work that I'm doing. The most important thing, I suppose, is that I'm also working with families, and that's with parents sometimes, that's with siblings. I run sibling groups, and I'm working directly with autistic people with a range of abilities and a range of challenges in their lives. Those challenges are often caused by neurotypical non-autistic people. Okay, I want to just quickly talk about neurodiversity, and because it's a phrase that's coming into use a lot. And neurodiversity refers to the fact that not all brains take the same developmental pathway. In other words, all our brains develop differently, and they respond to the environments we're in, and that impacts upon how the brain develops. So some of us will have great strengths in some areas, we'll have weaknesses in other areas developmentally. If you use your brain a lot to remember things, that part of the brain develops for you. But whilst many adults have neurotypical minds and bodies, others develop in a different way. And this is the group that we talk about being neurodiverse. And within that group, it's almost an umbrella term. And under the umbrella are different groups of people. So but autistic individuals, children and people come under that title now of being neurodiverse. So does ADHD, so does Down syndrome, Tourette syndrome, dyslexia, and something, dyscalculus, which is something we're talking a lot about at the moment. And you don't have to be autistic to have dyscalculus. Dyscalculus is difficulties with working with numbers when the numbers are wrote down, so similar to dyslexia. But just to give the idea of this umbrella term that you may come across when you're meeting with professionals, or you may come across in the media. And I just thought it was a good idea just to say, we're talking about neurodiverse people, we're talking about autistic people. And one of the things that is developing is this idea that when you're working with neurodiversity, you're working neurodiversity affirming approaches. And that's about acknowledging that all young people with autism, in our case, and adults with autism develop in different ways, but they will all have their strengths, their interests, their areas of difficulty and areas of needs. And very often when we're talking about autism, people concentrate on the difficulties, on the problems, and like everybody else, we'll be doing a little bit of that. But it is important to remember, when your brain's neurodiverse, it will have strengths, it will have special interests, it will have capabilities, as well as areas of difficulty. And so when we're working with autistic people, it's acknowledging the whole person and not just the weaknesses, not just the difficulties. And an important concept, perhaps, and for professionals particularly, is recognizing that when we're working with autistic people, it's not just about meeting their needs. And it would be good if their needs were always fully met, but it's more than that. If you think about yourself, or if you're not an autistic person, if you just have your needs met, life is pretty dull. You know, you don't need to go shopping and have exciting time shopping if you've got any money nowadays, because you could stay at home and just have your needs for food met by having takeaways, by having food delivered. But that wouldn't be very exciting for those who enjoy shopping. You don't need, we don't concentrate on just meeting our needs. A lot of us, we're concentrating on social, we're concentrating on being happy and other things. So neurodiverse approaches say we meet the needs of the whole person. That includes looking at what makes them happy, what makes their life meaningful. And it's those things that are quite important. In the short talk like this, it's difficult to fully explore this concept of working with the whole person. But it's also about taking into consideration their views about what's good for them, their views about what they want out of life, and recognizing that they have this wonderful amount of insight, sometimes autistic people, into their own needs and own life, if we can tune into it. The approach finds ways to work with the strengths of the individual, so that they can participate in their care. And this will be at a different level for every person with autism. Some of the people you're caring for will be almost totally reliant upon you for personal care, to get around, to just engage in simple tasks, where other people, and some of you might be present on this talk, will be fairly independent or quite independent. Some autistic people have jobs and working very working industries and work at the very top of the kind of jobs out there. So last week before, I talked to 72 scientists working in the nuclear power industry, and the majority of them were autistic and doing quite well, but still needed care and support from their families, and still needed a lot of support for social situations and to get through life. The week before, I talked to 20 bankers, some quite senior, who were all autistic and relied upon, at work they were brilliant, but at home they relied upon carers very often, sometimes partners, sometimes family members, in order to function, to the ability that they could. And so it's working with the strengths so that they can be successful. Being autistic is not a set of symptoms, but a valid lived identity. And this sounds a little bit complex, but being autistic is about who you are. It's not just about your disability, is what I'm trying to get over there. It's not just the fact that you struggle with communication. Autism is an integrated part of your personality, of who you are. It means you see life differently to other people. It means you have different strengths, different abilities. So I've just put this in very quickly to say, this is where we're going. You'll hear the terminology coming up a lot about neurodiversity, and there's a few words about what that means so that you can get some insight if the concept is new to you. But the key thing is that autistic people fall under this umbrella, but they come with their needs, strengths, abilities, and their whole person. I want you to look at the screen. One of the keys to supporting autistic people is appreciation that their world is a little bit different, that the way they see things is different, the way they feel things is different, the way they communicate can be different. And it's for non-autistic people, it's having that appreciation of that and that it's okay. Just quickly, if we were together as a group, this causes all kinds of debate, this picture. But what do you see? And you can use chat just to let me know what you see. But what do you see? Generally, and there are some exceptions, but most people either see an old woman or they see a young woman. And have a look at that. What do you see? And if you were together in a group, people start to say, well, I can't see a young woman. You know, I can see an old woman, but not young. And the people next to them are saying, well, don't be silly. You know, obviously it's an old woman. And people start to have arguments about it. Some of you might be able to see both.
Yeah, we've got a few comments coming in. Lots of people saying a lady with fur and hat, young lady, and then some people saying initially the younger woman and then noticing the elder woman after seeing the picture for a bit long.
Yeah, the more you look at it, and you might think, what's this to do with autism? It's that principle that I mentioned, that autistic people see the world differently, experience the world differently. Just as when you're looking at that picture, you're seeing it different to other people. And, you know, some people are seeing exactly the same. If we're in a group and people were around you were saying, don't be silly, it's an old woman, you'd get a bit annoyed with them because you say, no, it's not. I see a young woman. When we're working with autism, it's that appreciation that what they're seeing may be different, what they're smelling, what they're tasting may be coming over as different. Therefore, the way they process things and interact with us might be different. But because it's different doesn't mean it's wrong. And one of the key things I get over when looking at this is, look, if you don't see what other people see, that's okay. When working with autistic people, they may say, I don't see that in the same way. When I look at that doesn't appear to me. And very often in the past, education systems and care have said, well, you're wrong, because the majority of us see this. Now we're realizing it's okay to see things differently. If I had the opportunity, I'd get someone who can see a young lady to describe to the group how they see the young lady, so that everyone can see the young lady, and the same for the older person. And working with autism, it's saying, I accept what you can see, I accept what you experience in life, but I need to help you to see what I see, and I need help from you to see what you see. I hope that makes sense. But it's about appreciation of a different world, a different way of processing, a different way of experiencing things, but not an inferior one. I work with people who probably autistic people who earn more money than most of us put together sometimes. Directors of very, very big, important companies, but they're successful because of their autism, because they experience things differently, because they problem solve differently. I want to do a quiz. Don't worry if you get none right. If you get everyone right, great. And the reason we do this, particularly when I'm online, it gives me a chance to talk about some of the underpinning ideas around autism and facts and figures, but perhaps in a more interesting way. The first question says the word autism comes from the Greek. So we know autism is a Greek word, but what does it mean? And I was absolutely shocked recently. And I was doing some work with doctors, and there was about 50 of them, and only about 20 knew what the word autism meant. And I thought, that's a bit worrying, isn't it? If you go to the doctor and say, I think I've got autism, at least you'd expect them to know what the word means. So what does it mean? Is it alone, isolated, self, or mute? What do people think it means?
So a few answers coming into the chat, and lots of people are saying self.
And the answer is self. So well done if you got that right. And the reason it's my first question is because it's a good idea to know what we're talking about and the words we use. But more important than that, that the autistic brain is about self. It seeks out information that's relevant to it, to themselves. It processes. When they're in interaction with us, they're looking for things that make sense just to them. Very often, it's about the self. When they walk in a room, they notice things that are important just to them. That does not mean that they're selfish. Selfish is different. Selfish is if you were sat with someone now and you've got a bag of sweets and you're sneaking the sweets into your mouth, that's selfish, because you know, most of you will know that other people would like your sweets, so you're deliberately not sharing. Autistic people, it's not that they understand other people's needs for sweets in this example and don't want to give them. It's they may not even begin to think what other people need, because their brain is providing them with information about themselves and processing that. Of course, it's to different degrees according to how affected by autism or how much the brain is dominated by certain parts. But it is an important thing that to recognize that our brain is a social brain on a good day. We notice things about people. We notice things about social when we walk into a room. And so when we're interacting, we have that advantage of having our brain providing us with lots of information about people. Sometimes the autistic brain doesn't provide that information. So it looks like they're not interested in people. It looks like they're not able to meet our needs. It looks like they can't share. But if we present information in a way that the autistic brain works, then they can do those things. So starting off, it is recognition that when we're supporting autistic people, you come from a position of meeting their needs, of explaining things from their point of view, of interacting in ways that their brain can make sense of. I hope that makes sense to people in this very short session. Autism is a mental illness. What do people think? True or false? Any ideas?
Yeah, a few answers coming in, and most, yeah, all saying false, actually.
And again, you know, we've got a very informed group, haven't we? We often have when we're working with carers. The answer is that it is false. But, and I often use the two words, but. Yeah, in terms of diagnostic criteria, in terms of being an illness, autism is not. But mental health issues are, you know, the last research I saw said that about 73% of autistic individuals and, you know, children, young people, adults will have a mental health issue around anxiety, high levels of anxiety, high levels of social stress, high levels of worry. That's not worry, you know, about how we're going to pay the bill because nobody's got any money. It's worry to a level that impacts upon your ability to interact, to function in everyday life. Anxiety to a level that it paralyzes you as an autistic person. And I very often, people don't seem to recognize this, that if we're to support autistic people, you very often have to start with the stress and anxiety. Because when we're anxious, we can't learn. When we're anxious, we can't function. That's true for any of us. If you've learned to drive, do you remember getting in the car that first time and you thought, I'm quite a clever person. I know my left from my right. I've learned all the things about wing, mirror, maneuver, whatever it is. It's a long time since for me. You learn all that. You get confidently into the car. And within 5 seconds, you start to think, what's the matter with me? I know nothing. He said, turn right, and I've gone left. He said, do your maneuvers. And I'm thinking, I don't know what that is. Because of the anxiety of the lesson, your abilities are impacted upon, even things you know. You may have gone for a job interview feeling very confident because you'd learnt everything. And you get in there and they ask you a simple question and you get it wrong. That's what anxiety does. If you imagine living with that, the autistic person who has skills, has abilities, but the levels of worry and anxiety stops them using them. And I go to schools and I still hear staff sometimes saying, well, you know the answer to that, don't you? You knew yesterday. But yesterday I weren't anxious. I weren't stressed. And so I could do things easily. So recognition that it's not a mental illness, but high levels of stress and anxiety impact. The other thing that we're looking at the moment is that we're discovering that many autistic people catastrophize. And this is important within families. Some of you, if you're not autistic, may catastrophize. That is, you start off with a little worry and you build it up till that little worry becomes the world's going to end in 10 minutes kind of thing. Autistic people also do that. And it stops them functioning, stops them trying new things, stops them going out sometime because they worry about the catastrophe that might happen that isn't based upon factual things, isn't based on their reality. So some important issues popping up there about mental health and mental illness. Number of children with autism or autistic children. Yeah, 10 in 10,000, 91 in 10,000, 170 in 10,000, or 25 in 10,000. What do people think? Won't spend a lot of time upon it. But the answer, there's lots of answers out there at the moment, but the one used by the National Autistic Society and other groups is 91 in 10,000. That translates to 1 in 100 approximately. Some new research in America and some research that's coming out in this country says it's probably going to be about 1 in 60 people have autism. You know, there's debate about it. I think the important thing to say is there's a lot of autistic people out there. And this is based on the people we know about. Of course, there'll be people you meet every day. There'll be people listening to this who say, you know, I think I'm autistic, you know, but I haven't got a diagnosis. The numbers are high. Autism is caused by poor diet. What do people think? True or false? The answer is false. I can't go into the detail because it'd take me an hour or so, but it's false at the moment. There's interesting research going on, and there's lots of evidence over the years that, you know, for a small number perhaps, and that's debatable, autism might be caused by diet. That word poor is a wrong word, but it allows me to talk about this very quickly. We're not talking that, you know, when mum was pregnant, she had 20 beef burgers or McDonald's a week. We're not talking about that kind of poor diet. We're talking about the baby, the unborn baby, not being able to get the vitamins, etc., from the mum's diet that it required for the brain to develop. Mum might have had the best diet in the world. It's the capacity of the baby to get that. There may be links, and certainly is, for some around dairy products, around other food groups that are important to the brain developing. But generally, it's not because, you know, in the early years, people with autism were fed poor diets. They may have been fed inappropriate diets. That's because of our lack of knowledge and understanding about what the brain needs. Which of these is not part of the dyad of impairments? I'll explain this quickly, the question. Up until recently, we talked about the triad of impairments. And you might be thinking, what's this dyad? The reason we've gone from 3 to 2 is we now talk, I'm going to answer the question, but we now talk about social communication and interaction differences as one, because it's hard to communicate and that without interacting. It's hard to interact without communicating. And in the past, we separated them and we had 3, but now we've joined them together. The odd one out there that is not used for diagnosis purposes is difficulties with language. That is because some people with autism have a wonderful vocabulary. Some people have wonderful language. And it's not language in terms of spoken language that's the difficulty. It's the understanding, it's the communication, it's the interaction that's difficult. And the second part is restricted and repetitive patterns of behaviors. Those, if you're living with autism, and many of you will be, either as an autistic person or as part of a family, you will recognize that straight away. That, you know, having to get up at a set time. If it's a child, when they're getting dressed, having to pull their underpants up and down 10 times before they can move on to the next thing. Doing things in a set way, having interests that are very you know, specialists sometimes from an early age. The ones with children, it is around Thomas the Tank Engine, Frozen, Mario, and all of those kind of things. But also, for some, it's intellectual special interests. Working with two brothers who are very, very different, but both autistic. But their interest, one is interested in philosophy and psychology. He's 16-year-old. Before he talked to me properly, I had to be able to discuss German philosophy with him, because that's his interest, that's his way in. I'm working with a phenomenal young man at the moment. And his mum calls him Ant-Man, because his interest is ants. And some of you won't be able to go to his house because he's got all these containers, temperature control containers of ants and cockroaches and other types of insects, etc. Phenomenal knowledge about them, phenomenal interest. But you know, it can get in the way. That's the thing about interest. And in the past, people have tried to stop the special interests, but now we recognize it's a key to future development. It's a way of interacting with people. It's a starting point for communication. It's only when the special interest becomes so big that it impacts upon the quality of life. I do realize we're not going to get very far in this short session. Maybe if you think it's worth it, we can look at things in more detail in some other time. But links between autism and genetic causes, what do people think?
A few answers coming into the chat. Some saying probably true, true to some degree.
Yeah. Good answers. We used to say definitely true. I think for the majority, the answer is true. I have learned after 40 years of working in autism that the moment you say something is absolute and true, some new evidence pops up that makes you question it. There is research going on that is saying maybe not in all cases. So the answers that were a bit vague is where we are, but majority of information on the internet will say it's true, but not a single gene, a mixture of genetics making what we call the triad of the dyad of impairment. I'm not going to ask you to name two other conditions that exist alongside autism, because by the time I've read your comments, unfortunately, the time will be over. I've just put a slide up and you can have a look at it in your own leisure. But just saying, look, autism doesn't come in this neat little package that is autism. In other words, communication, interaction difficulties, rigidity of thought, and that's it. There's other conditions existing alongside the autism. And what we often used to call learning disabilities, or lots of people still do, now some people call it intellectual disabilities. Dawson, and he couldn't be wrong in a sense, it is so vague, but 25 to 70% of people with autism will have an intellectual disability. I think the latest research is saying it's possibly 50% or even less than that, as we're recognizing and getting better at diagnosing autism in women and people who have no learning or intellectual disability. Number of people with autism and ADHD, it's an interesting one. There's lots of research going on at the moment. And from my work, I would say I'm seeing roughly between 30 and 50% of people I'm working with at the moment have both ADHD and autism together alongside each other. And there is a reluctance to diagnose both. I was with a carer, and they said they'd taken their child to the doctors. Their child had a diagnosis of autism, but they were seeing the ADHD characteristics and were concerned about them and how they could be managed. And the doctor said, "Aren't you happy with one diagnosis? Do you know how much it costs to get a child diagnosed with ADHD?" It's not about money. It's not about having labels. Some forms of ADHD can be helped tremendously by medication, not always permanently needed, but as a way in. There are approaches to ADHD and autism that are different from how you just approach autism. So it is important where there's other conditions that we recognize those and we work with those. But an interesting, perhaps interesting to me, but I mentioned two brothers. One is autistic and absolutely brilliant brain, but doesn't get to use it because of high levels of anxiety, rigidity of thought and behavior. One is ADHD and autism, and the ADHD gives him a drive towards social. So though the autism is saying, don't go out and play tennis, Sean, don't go out and do this with your mates, the ADHD is actually a positive thing that makes him want to and gives him almost the energy to do things. Not always that positive. The number of people with epilepsy, particularly where there's an intellectual impairment, is about 1 in 3 by mid-adolescence. One of the key things to mention is the autistic people often have gastrointestinal difficulties. There's problems with the gut, and that affects their health very often. So I don't know of any research yet, but I would say 50% of all autistic people I'm working with, and probably even more, talk about having constipation or diarrhea to a level that is a health problem. And some of them, when I'm working, I specialize in behaviors of concern, challenging behavior. When I'm working with behaviors, underpinning those is often constipation. And when you ask the carer, they say, well, he was almost born, or she was almost born constipated, and it's gone on and on and on untreated. So gastrointestinal problems. Also, what you see, possibly because of the way the gut works, is if you've got an autistic child or you're an autistic person, you may have more ear infections than the average member of the population. You may have more runny noses, throat infections, and may have skin problems that are higher than the average population, and all tied in perhaps to the immune system and the gut and the way certain foods are processed. So, you know, lots of things there. Possible misdiagnosis still, shouldn't be, but of schizophrenia. But if you're an older person and you're supporting older people, I'm still coming across adults with autism who have gone 20, 30 years with a misdiagnosis, and that has a massive impact. And our research is saying that misdiagnosis or non-diagnosis traumatizes the brain of the autistic person. And just to throw it in, there's some fascinating work at the moment around autism and being traumatized by your autism. Not because you're mistreated, because you haven't got the treatment, the support for some aspects of your autism that you need. For example, sensory. I'm aware we're going to get stopped before I've got anywhere from my point of view, but the key problems and social interaction and communication, restricted, repetitive, stereotyped behaviors. That I just want to mention a group, a growing number, and that is girls and women. we're still not very good at recognizing girls and women with autism. And there's a male bias, because I want to be fair, I've put possible male bias. There is a male bias towards, looking at autism. If a girl comes for a diagnosis with autism, if a woman comes, they're still looking at them as though they were males. And autism in females is different and very different. And some people are campaigning at the moment for separate diagnostic criteria so that people pick up on females with autism. Some of the things that happens with women is they mask better, they cover it up. They tend to be a little bit more social. These are generalizations. I'm not a big fan of the word masking, because that seems to present, if you're literal brain, autistic brain, that it's about face and covering your face and that type of thing. A better word is camouflaging. And autistic women are saying to me, we don't just mask, we camouflage. All my life, I've tried to merge with the scenery so that people do not pick up on my differences, do not pick up on my autism. I met a girl, and after 10 minutes, 20 minutes of talking to her, I said, do you always sit like that? And she was sat properly, like a Victorian schoolgirl. And she says, what do you mean? And to cut a long story short, she controlled her body so much so that she thought people would see her as normal, but she hadn't got an understanding of how her body should be. I hope that makes sense. And that's the same in language, and that's the same in social interaction and other things. So women do camouflage. That is not to say men don't, but we see more of it in women. More likely to develop communication interaction skills quicker. Something that's not on the slide that I will put in if I ever get a moment is that in autism, there's almost two expressions of autism. You get the externalized expression of autism. You may have children who show this, or young people in your families. Externalized is the world gets the autism because they show aggression, they show fear, they show the stress. Everything's out there for everybody to see. The other expression of autism is internalized autism. And this often happens with women, that they blame themselves. They keep it tied in to themselves. They don't express it. In some ways, while it's damn difficult to live with, the externalized autism is slightly more healthy in a sense. Because what happens if you internalize it? It affects your mental health. It is no coincidence that there's the autistic girls and women have higher levels of occurrence of self-harm than the average population. Not the average autism population, but the average population. There's more self-harm with autistic people. There's more dietary difficulties, going to extremes, where they're not eating, where they are on drips. And sometimes it's gone to the extreme because the dietitians and others working with them hasn't recognized that the root of the problem is in the autism or the gustatory system, that's the mouth and other things. More likely to self-harm then, more likely to have eating disorders, less likely to get the right kind of support. And just to illustrate that, a lady in her 30s came to see me. She looked about 60 because life has been very, very, very difficult for her. And exploring it with her, she's taken to drugs very early on because she couldn't meet her own needs and nobody else was meeting her needs. And the reason I mention it is quite simply, she had 3 brothers still has, all got diagnosed as autistic in adolescence. She has just started on the road to getting a diagnosis at 30 something. Why? Because she's a woman. Because people weren't looking at her autism. People got her down as a bullshit teenager, as having learning disability. She was neither of those. She was a desperate young girl, desperate for someone who understood her autism. That's why this slides in to say how important it is to recognise autism in women and girls and put in the right support that might be slightly different to what it is for some adults, males with autism. We talked about the spectrum in the couple of minutes I know I've got to say that, look, autism doesn't present the same with everyone. That's why it's kept me interested for 40 years and confused for 40 years. It presents differently. It goes from, you've got those people who are autistic and manage really well in life most of the time, and hold down jobs, and are intelligent people, and do quite well with the support of families very often and carers, but sometimes on their own. And you have on the same, spectrum, as it were, those who are totally reliant on other people for their toileting needs, to feed them, to dress them, and have intellectual disabilities and severe intellectual impairments. And that's the spectrum of autism. It's not that simple, because I work with people and I'm working with kids who are diagnosed with autism. I've go to special schools. They struggle to read, write, so therefore have learning disabilities, but put them on a computer and they make me and you look almost, stupid when they're on, because they're brilliant. Some of you might know the name Ken Bruce. Has anybody heard of Ken Bruce? He's a Radio 2 presenter. He's got a child with autism, or went through school, learning disabilities, special schools. Yeah. Went to an adult provision. They introduced him to computers, let him go on computers, and they found all the way through school he'd been learning wonderful things. He'd been picking things up. His main problem wasn't that he wasn't, he couldn't learn. That the problem was he got no way of presenting it, of telling people what he knew. One of the top mathematicians in the world has never spoken a word and is autistic. And it's about looking at autism and saying it is complex. Just because a child doesn't speak doesn't mean they're not intelligent. Just because they speak doesn't mean they haven't got any problems and difficulties and that they don't need support. Most of the people I see now in my kind of clinics, for want of a better word, is very able autistic people who are struggling with mental health and other associated problems. So that's the spectrum. When you see TV at the moment, you see people on the spectrum, on our autistic people, but they don't tend to have learning disabilities or intellectual impairments. So you see people like Paloma Faith, who's autistic, but has communication problems. You don't know if you're not looking for them, but that gives an impression that everybody who's autistic is going to be like them. That is not true, of course. We've got, communication-wise, there's a number of difficulties, differences. I've put the apparent lack of desire. I've learned over the years not to say they don't desire to communicate. I don't think I've ever worked with anyone who doesn't want to communicate, who is autistic. They often haven't got the means. We haven't sometimes got the skills. the understanding to enable them to. But it's that ability that comes from us to watch them, spend time with them and say, how are they communicating? They are communicating, but is it a simple, touch means something, twisting the air means something. If you're interested in this, one of the best writers on this subject is Phoebe Caldwell. And if she's still alive, because she's even older than me and she's speaking, do try and get hold of Phoebe Caldwell. She is doing tremendous work around understanding people with intellectual impairments, no language that we understand, but actually working with them and understanding their communication. Difficulties initiating, maintaining and ending communication. We haven't got time to go through all these on this session. You can see that they're quite complex, but the thing to say, each of these will be different for different people. And just a simple one, like ending interaction and communication. You can have very, very able people who struggle with this, and so they come over as being rude. One of the biggest complaints from mainstream teachers, I once taught every teacher in North Wales over 3 years, and the biggest thing was they're rude. They come up to me, the kids with autism, they ask me a question, I answer the question, and they just walk off. Why don't they say, thank you, sir? Why don't they say, oh, that was interesting, like the other kids do? Because ending communication interaction is difficult in autism. And we have to teach it, and we have to enable for people to do it. And there's lots of things there that are complex and need more time. But it's about recognizing that the individual communicate differently, that things we find easy, the language of everyday communication, the idioms, are difficult for autistic people. And things like raining cats and dogs, watch your step. We use language like that all the time without an understanding of how that is perceived by the autistic person. This misunderstandings is not around whether you are the brightest intelligent person with autism in the world or person with learning disabilities. It's about how the autistic brain works. But some people have the capacity to learn this language, but they learn it by rote. They remember what things mean. But new phrases come along that cause problems. When lockdown was introduced, I got a lot of phone calls and Skypes and things like that, and saying, what does lockdown mean, Geoff? And people were saying, I've looked it up on the internet, and lockdown is what happens in prisons, where when you've been very bad, they come and lock you down in your cell. Does that mean the government's going to lock us in our houses? That thought never entered most people's mind. But that is the autistic literal interpretation, one meaning for one word. And so we can see why they struggle with communication and why they need carers who understand the difficulties and problems and explain it to them. I realise my time has gone, Marie. And
it's okay. You can,
we've only done 2 and a bit slides, but that doesn't matter. I've tried to give an impression of autism. Of course, as carers, I think we don't support carers enough with practical strategies and things, and that takes time. But things like practical strategies around helping people dress with autism, understanding textures, understanding sensory, the importance of colour in our houses for autistic people. And there's so much there that, that needs to be understood, but hopefully giving you a taste, and a taste that says, look, it's not all gloom and doom. You know, people with autism have great capacity to learn and to function, but we need to facilitate it and work in ways that recognise neurodiversity, strengths and abilities.